after the collapse of the communist regime in 1992, and then Afghanistan fall in the civil war after the Mujahideen occupied Kabul and Afghanistan. So we left Afghanistan. For me, and I can confirm more than 98% of the Arabs, non-Afghan fighters, left Afghanistan. Even Osama bin Laden, he left to Sudan because very simple, this is not anymore of a legitimate war. This is a civil war. So we left Afghanistan forever with the wound in the heart that we did not achieve what we fought for. We fought to see a good country, good Islamic state, strong state, but unfortunately the opposite took place. Civil war, people living in a miserable life. I'm not here to blame this side or that side. I mentioned this in some details in my book. But day by day, year by year, this journey was not finished. I thought maybe, especially for my case, I switched straight to my country, to Algeria, because in that time, if you remember, the first experience of democratic transition took place in Algeria, where the FIS, the Islamic Front of Salvation, took the majority, and then the military coup took place, and they cancelled the election, illegalized the political party, put in the jail all the leaders, and then Algeria. So I was from Afghanistan. I became in the political committee council in my political party in Algeria, but not inside Algeria, outside of Algeria. But the impact or the influence of Jihad al-Afghani, Afghan Jihad, in that time, if you remember, it was among the Ummah, the first issue was the Jihad of Afghanistan. Jihad of Afghanistan was even before the Intifada of 87, which is led to establish Hamas, and before even the coup of Hassan Turabi in 89 in Sudan, and even before the influence of the FIS in Algeria. If you go back to that period, to that era, the only hope or in the only issue was mobilizing the Muslim world was the Jihad of Afghanistan. So the Jihad of Afghanistan was, what can I say, the star of the issues in the Muslim world, not only in the Muslim world, even in the world, yeah, in the level of the world. So that's day by day shows how important that journey I took in Afghanistan, and how important those people coming day by day important in the memory of the history, in the memory of the new generations, politicians, journalists, academics, Islamists, non-Islamists. So that day coming, that journey, that jihad, those people who fought in Afghanistan, Afghans and non-Afghans, by the passing time, this story, this issue becoming more important in the world.
Khyber Pass is the key to crossing between Pakistan into Nangarhar province, Afghanistan, located east of the country, which borders Logar, Kabul, Kagman, and Kunar provinces. It has a long, illustrious history which witnessed the Muslim invasions of the Indian subcontinent, but from 1979, it was used by Afghan rebel forces traveling to and fro, as well as receiving armaments from the Pakistan government under President Zia-ul-Haq and Hamid Gul, the Pakistan ISI Director General. Tribal leaders such as Abdul Rasul Sayyaf Maulavi Jalulullah Haqqani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and Muhammad Yunus Khalis traveled along the Khyber Pass into the vast Peshawar Valley, where it was governed under Saif. From there, they would then plan and orchestrate operations against the Soviets. The Arab television and radio stations were functioning nonstop in every cafe, coffee shop, and outdoor ledge of desert brown colored homes that had them. While young Afghan and Arab males who had served and heard the calls by these tribal leaders, a middle-aged theologian in Jordan who had been on the Arabs to enter the conflict. His name was Abdullah Yusuf Azam. Azam had been teaching in Egypt, Jordan, and soon Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on Sharia jurisprudence. However, Afghans were quite an insular group led by a polarizing fraternal sect of warring clans who had differences anywhere from the ideological to a regular standard of living. They were not welcoming the idea of foreign Arab fighters into their ranks. They considered Arabs less experienced in the art of guerrilla warfare and theologically abrasive. Simply just being in the way of the war, weary Afghans who had been fighting not just the Soviets, but also the communist-backed Afghan government under Babrak Kamal, who was appointed as the country's third democratic president, backed by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, for which Kamal was a primary leading member of. However, Kamal was less ideological, seductive, and seclusive from his predecessors, Hafizullah Amin and Muhammad Nur Taraki. For instance, Kamal reintroduced the old Afghan custom of having an Islamic invocation every time the government issued a proclamation, and institute non-communist bloc members to work in the highest positions of government. However, it was ultimately the Soviets who ran the country and its government. The Pashtuns didn't have much agreement with a communist socialist invader. The country's capital, Kabul, was under Soviet rule. Hekmatyar and Saif began constructing camps for Afghans to train in Peshawar. The Hekmatyar group, the Hizb-e-Islami, were the largest Afghan clan in the region, dominating many others, even far more than Saif's Tanzi-e-Dahati-Islami. Non-profit organizations known as NGOs began funneling money to Pakistan, as well as the Pakistan ISI, who began training Afghans and their officers in combat situations. Tens of millions of dollars began coming from foreign NGOs, Saudi donors, and of course, the intelligence services like the CIA, Pakistan ISI, British MI6, and the Israeli Mossad. Pakistan President ul-Haq had every reason to start military training in the Afghan rebel forces, for he feared the communist bloc could very well collapse Afghanistan, which would threaten the Islamic Sunni community of Islamabad, and then Jalalabad and Peshawar. Thus, the Pakistan intelligence service began funneling arms and training to the many Afghan factions. An Algerian-born scholar named Abdullah Anas would become a large influence with the Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. While in Algeria, he became aware of the Tablighi Jamaat, an Islamic missionary movement in which he thought of them as to be politically immature and unrealistic. However, in Egypt, he would send money and teachers and advisors to the country in the 1970s, many of them with direct links to the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt was considered a leading country in the Muslim Brotherhood, for it was founded there. Algeria itself was witnessing a transformation in the country during this time, as the French began forming their own communities, and the government under Shadi Benejad, who witnessed the economy failing due to rapidly falling oil prices. Tension rose between elements of the regime who supported Benejad economic liberalization policies and those who wanted to return to the status model. Anas was hardly a follower of the religious Islamic movement, but he suddenly became interested in the teachings of a known scholar named Abbassi Madani, the founder of the Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS. Madani brought the ideas of Muhammad Ghazali and Sayyid Qutb to Anas, thus bringing Anas closer to learning more about the Islamic movements led by the Muslim Brotherhood and Algerian Islamic Front. Through vigorous reading, he became aware of socialist-led governments oppressing the Arab public in favor of Western-style living and free trade with countries who suppress Muslims in general. Plus, there was the Israel-Palestine problem. Madani became a great teacher to Anas and looked to him as his own son. Later in 1990, Abbassi helped organize a general strike and massive peaceful demonstrations in Algiers, which was repressed by the armed forces, in which they arrested Madani. He would serve 12 years imprisonment. However, Anas was interested in a conflict which now caught his heart and mind: Afghanistan. He had met with the great and enigmatic leader Abdullah Anas back in 1988, in which he would later proclaim to the emir that the assistance coming from NGOs should not be the primary source of help for the Afghans, but from the Arab community. This war had to be dominated by the Afghan Arab community and not from the foreign stage. Anas was close to Anas's heart and considered him his dearest friend and poignant influence in spiritual matters. Anas had that effect on anyone he met, with his parkour hat and ubiquitous manners, while delivering mesmerizing speeches, which he often held at home for his students who would visit after classes in Egypt and Jordan. Anas, however, found his calling. It was delivered to him by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf in Peshawar. It was Afghanistan and the global call for an Islamic Jihad, a defensive jihad, one where he could finally try and collect his minds and hearts of Afghans and Arabs. An impossible task for anyone. But Anas knew if anyone could, it would be Anas himself. But the divisive political nature in Peshawar was far too great a hurdle for Anas to overcome. He instead catered to the minds of the young men who arrived by the thousands from all over the world. Anas implored that Afghan tribal leaders like Hekmatyar, Haqqani, and Khalis had to be at the forefront of economic aid, not the foreign agencies, and not from the Arab community. This was an Afghan war and must stay that way. For he and Anas both feared that foreign entities would take advantage of the situation and hijack the conflict to twist it into their version of what the conflict was about. Many Afghan edicts were raised when the Soviets invaded Kabul. They wanted to free the country from secular ideals, and so the religious ulema of Afghanistan issued a fatwa, while the United Nations issued Resolution 462 against the Soviet invasion in January 9th, 1980. Mohammad Najibullah, head of the Khadamat-e-Hayat-e-Dawati, the State Information Service, planned to shut down the northern Afghanistan, for it was an important route for the Soviets, in which it relied on some roads and valleys for supplies, namely Kandahar and Pasjir. However, Najibullah and the Soviet KGB later cooperated to fight against the leader of the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud, instead. The Soviet aerial bombing was incessant, sometimes days and even weeks, with the campaigns continue to bomb the Pasjir Valley, as Mujahideen fighters oftentimes did not come out of their enclaves for fear of being seen and the camp destroyed by the Soviets' air assaults. Anas would sometimes lead his command to the roads leading to Kandahar under such tumultuous conditions: mud, rain, wind, and the constant air assaults. However, Anas always led by example and was the first in line leading the way. But the need for combining Afghan forces was the primary solution to the Soviet problem. However, the Afghans were notoriously known for being sectarian and often had complaints about joining forces with one another. Anas thought the key to defeating the Soviets, however, would be to reconcile the differences between Hekmatyar and Massoud, the two largest divisions in the Afghan conflict at the moment. During the course of the conflict, Hekmatyar and Sayyaf would suffer major losses against the Soviet-backed Afghan government in Kabul. But so did the young Saudi, Osama bin Laden. The Jalalabad inclusion, which was guaranteed by ul-Haq and Hamid Gul, was sent south. Saudis came in the country, but one Saudi began using his father's influence in the construction business, the Saudi bin Laden group, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden began constructing an Arab base south of the country, Al-Masada, also known as the Lion's Den, a camp that catered strictly just to Arabs. Other camps were not as inclusive. However, later, Sayyaf and Haqqani would have Arabs join their ranks. Other Afghans saw this as heretical. Massoud was blamed for his non-participation in the conflict during Jalalabad, which Pakistan now saw Massoud as a non-state actor and someone who couldn't be counted on in the future. Massoud, however, wanted an independent Afghanistan, not an extension of Pakistan policies. However, according to the National Archives, Mikhail Gorbachev had meetings with the United States under Ronald Reagan about the need for an independent Afghanistan without foreign assistance. Quote, the Soviet decision to withdraw from the disastrous military invasion of Afghanistan occurred as early as October 1985, according to the documents. But Gorbachev did not set a specific timetable until February of 1988, while he sought to create a model of cooperation with the United States for resolving regional conflicts. While the Soviets shared the U.S. goal of an independent Afghanistan, they were equally weary of the power of radical fundamentalists who dominated in the Pakistan-based resistance supported by the United States as well. The Soviet leadership believed that the process of national reconciliation would culminate in free elections under UN monitoring, and the resulting government would be secular and moderate. However, the documents show that eventually the Soviets accepted the fact that the Reagan administration would continue to arm the more radical factions of the Mujahideen through Pakistan, even in violation of the Geneva agreements. Gorbachev was hoping that progress toward the political settlement could be made by working together with the United States after the signing of the Geneva agreements, thus creating a precedent and further cementing U.S.-Soviet global cooperation, end quote. Gorbachev and the Soviet Politburo, the policy-making authority within the Communist Party, warned of unilateral withdrawal of Afghanistan in 1987, with Pakistan President Gulhum Ishaq Khan and Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto leading the negotiations between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. The withdrawal was set. And on February 14, 1989, the Soviets began to return home. The need for a new Afghanistan started with confusion as Anas and Massoud began to look down upon the valley of Panjshir and witnessed the rusted tanks decaying slowly under the sun by the river banks, tanks by the dozens, as if this was the graveyard of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan lived up once again to its traditional creed, the graveyard of empires. Now was the time to mend relationships, and Abdullah Anas began to use his reputable leverage to have Massoud and Hekmatyar come together finally. However, as the point came closer to that important meeting, an incident would take place that would halt it from ever happening again. On July 9, 1989, Saeed Jamal, a senior commander at Hekmatyar, led the Hizb-e Islami, had encountered members of the Shura-e-Nazar, Massoud's faction. Jamal had opened fire upon the group, killing 31 of them. His rivalry with Engineer Bashir over the Dakir provinces was split to treaties and truce violations. Anas, somber, traveled back to Massoud and told him about the incident, fearing Hekmatyar was behind it. Massoud didn't believe it, and Anas traveled to Peshawar, where Hekmatyar denied it, and the clan arrested Jamal, the once proud member of many men. He was later hanged for the offense, but the damage was already done. Massoud intended to create a force which would be transformed into a unified Islamic Afghan army to stabilize and rebuild the country after a Soviet withdrawal, which was the motivation for creating the Shura-e-Nazar. By January of 1990, Anas took control of the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Afghan Services Bureau. Just a month prior, he had met Mustafa Shalabi, a Palestinian who worked in the MAC office in Brooklyn, New York City, inside the Al-Kifa Refugee Center. Azam had begun the idea of the MAC, which was financially supported from Osama bin Laden and approved from Abdullah Rasul Sayyaf as early as 1992. But by 1987, the MAC guest houses started sharing rooms with members of a radical sect from Egypt, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Azam had went with Anas to Saudi Arabia to pitch the idea of building Afghan services homes and buildings to cater to the large influx of Arabs coming from around the world. Bin Laden liked the idea and wanted to become a part of a jihad against Soviet invaders. He became the primary financier of the Maktab al-Khidmat. many guest houses were open. However, when the Egyptians started coming in, their influence was notably beset and acknowledged. One of them was Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, and of course, Ayman al-Zohari, a surgeon and also a prominent member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. They were deemed takfiris, who are Muslims who declare other Muslims to be apostates for various reasons. They would consider a Muslim an apostate if they didn't agree with their ideology, or if you believed in democracy, or even if they did not declare Muslim leaders as infidels. Anas saw them as a dangerous influence to the young Arabs in the guest houses. Usually, these takfiris never entered the battle and always enjoyed backbiting other Afghan leaders, one of them being Anas's closest friend, Abdullah Anas. Anas, however, did not see that in bin Laden before the arrival of the Egyptians. Bin Laden was soft-spoken and well-mannered and had zero inclination to the Wahhabi ideology. However, Dr. Fadl had wrote the text that would be used to manipulate and form the radical mindset of young Arabs into the Wahhabi or Jihadis mindset. The book entitled Al-Umda fi Lad al-Uda, or The Essentials of Making Ready for Jihad. It became an important text for the future wave of terrorists in later years, and later al-Sharif would announce and renounce his ways and the text that he wrote. Besides the guest houses for Islamic Jihad, there was also smaller guest houses for the members of his adversary, the Gamma Islamiyah, headed by Omar Abdul Rahman. This group was considered the more moderate of the two, and new recruits at the MAC were processed and trained in camps like Khalid or Sada, each holding up to 250 or so mujahideen, along with Pakistan ISI officers who personally trained the Afghan officers, which usually took about 6 months. These camps were run by Abdul Rasul Sayaf in Peshawar. There were other camps from local tribesmen, Mahmud Rabbani's Khalid bin Walid camp, and Gulbuddin Hikmatar's Azam or Sark, Yunus Khalis located in the Patiya province, and Jalaluddin Haqqani's Banu Merah Shah camp. Over time, due to the ceaseless backbiting, extremist ideals and selfish ambitions, the MAC office was broken up. Earlier, in 1987, bin Laden split from the Bureau and created his own camp, al-Masada, in 1987. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad had compromised many young Arabs at the MAC. Rumors were spread, including that Azam was a Saudi spy. Azam was unwelcome in Pakistan, as critical reports to the Saudi Interior Minister, which spread another rumor that Azam was becoming a political threat. Not only that, Ayman al-Zawahiri was the one who spread that Azam was a Saudi spy. Azam, in hearing this, relocated to the Sada camp, which was at a safe distance from the prying eyes of the nefarious ISI and the Takfiris from Egypt. However, it was the Takfiris from Egypt who had begun manipulating the Shah bin Laden, knowing full well the potential he could bring with his lucrative finances from his father's Saudi firm. Abu Faras al-Suri, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Ahmed al-Jaziri, and Sayyid Imam al-Sharif would help spread the rumors and ill-proven ideas about Azam to bin Laden and the young Arabs at the MAC. In one such meeting between Azam and al-Jaziri, Azam had lamented about the fact that al-Jaziri, a physician who foolishly risked his well-being in a raid in which Azam was critical about his reckless conduct. Azam had asked, "What should one do?" Al-Jaziri replied, "You must first start with monotheism and correct their creed." Anas, who was in the meeting, rose up and warned al-Jaziri, "Have some manners," to which al-Jaziri abruptly left and relocated to Kuwait, where he would end up meeting with a known Takfiri cleric, Muhammad al-Makdisi. Makdisi would be the scholarly advisor to a young, impressionable jihadi later in Afghanistan. That jihadi was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who would later become the founder of the Jamaat al-Tawheed wal Jihad, which would later become the Islamic State in Iraq. However, the MAC needed new leadership, and with so many Arabs now falling under the impressionable leaders of the Islamic Jihad, Azam wanted to mend relationships between the Afghans and Arabs. Thus, he wanted to name bin Laden as its emir, but the original members of the MAC, including Anas and Azam, weren't there to witness the change in leadership. The Egyptians, however, were in full attendance and proclaimed bin Laden emir of the MAC in 1988. The rumors, however, didn't stop with Azam. Now there were rumors that Massoud was a Shiite Iranian spy. Anas called for a meeting with the guilty party and quickly dispelled the rumors. However, on November 24, 1989, Anas was called to a rush meeting with Massoud, who somberly welcomes him in. Anas notices that Massoud was not his usually jovial self. Massoud then spoke to Anas with a tone of voice to which Anas knew what he ultimately feared. Jihad is a difficult road. We all have buried people we have loved. Azam was dead. Anas and Massoud wept together. The Muslim Brotherhood, which had fostered by Azam, was now in tatters. With the Arab Afghans now factionalized, Azam's untimely death, partisanship, and extremism was now on the rise. The Arabs, who were once held under the relative companionship of the affable Sheikh, Azam, were now without their spiritual guide. They went looking for a new one. Thus, many Takfiris were now calling themselves caliphs. Sectarianism was now the new normal, and many Salafis were using Sharia to deem who was an apostate and who was not. The post-Soviet Afghanistan had other problems as well, especially from civil conflicts between Afghan and Arab groups. Hekmatyar and the Shiite faction, the Hizb-e-Wadar, were trying to carve up Kabul. Meanwhile, Sayyaf retreated to Pagham, located in the hills near the capital where Pashtuns and Tajiks lived, so as to not involve himself with the conflicts. Kabul, however, was in the control of an interim government led by Sigbatullah Mojadidi. Hekmatyar began attacking it with the Hizb-e-Islami faction. Massoud was not just opposed to Karmal, but also towards the fanatical sect led by Hekmatyar. He knew the country would fall into extremist hands of Hekmatyar if he was successful. The ever-ultra-charged Hekmatyar was adamantly opposed to Massoud due to his links with Abdul Rashid Datsam, the marshal in the Afghan National Army, and to the Shiite Wahadat Party, or the Hizb-e-Wahad. Hekmatyar claimed that Mojadidi government was un-Islamic, in which he would launch a corrective jihad in retaliation. But Mojadidi was well received by the public, to which he offered a general amnesty to all Afghans, except the deposed president, Mohammad Najibullah, whose fate would be decided by the public. He was fully supported by the rest of the Mujahideen, but all Hekmatyar's Hizb-e-Islami. It was now a civil war between the Muslims. Massoud saw Afghanistan as illegitimate, for there was no parliament, no constitution, or even elections. The country was incomplete. While the Takfiris celebrated the retreat of the Soviets, Anas had knew better. The Arabs minimally contributed to the conflict in total. Meanwhile, an Islamabad movement called the Taliban, headed by Muhammad Mullah Omar, began their traverse into Afghanistan. They were adamantly opposed to the Mojadidi government, as well as Massoud and the Hizb-e-Wahad, led by its founder, Abdul Ali Mazari. Mazari had believed the solution to the internal division in Afghanistan was in a federal system of governance, with each ethnic group having specific constitutional rights and able to govern their own lands and people. But in March 1995, he would be killed by Taliban members who told Mazari that they wanted a peace meeting in Shahar Masib near the capital, Kabul. He was abducted there, along with other members, tortured, and then killed by the Taliban. By 1993, Anas had left the country, seeking political exile in London, where many Afghans had regrouped to Pakistan. However, supported by the Taliban and Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, the fear was that the country in disarray, that the mortal enemy, India, would now take advantage of the situation and manipulate the circumstances and impose their own tribal factions. Even now, to this day, the Pakistan government continues to support the Haqqani network, while the United States had to literally reprimand the government under Pakistan, while Pakistan continually denies denouncing them as a terrorist organization. The battle for Lahore continues. The Afghan tribal leaders like Mullah Omar had all believed that they represented the state and disavowed the idea of a multi-party political system. This stubborn nature within the tribal factions has been this way for decades, even far prior to the Soviet invasion. But as Afghanistan was nearing civil war, Algeria was nearing a democracy. Algeria had achieved unity to force a change in the government, whereas Afghanistan could not. In 1988, under Benejad, riots had broken out, oil prices dropped, and with a slow political reformation, the youth of the country finally protested the regress. The Takfiris took full advantage of the situation. Anas's friend Abbassi Madani and Ali Benejad led the Salafists against the Algerian government, and their group, the Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS, was formed on February 18, 1989. The party had two major leaders representing its bases of its support. Madani appealed to the pious small businessmen, and Belhaj appealed to the angry, often unemployed youth of Algeria. Anas knew what could happen inside his homeland of Algeria because he experienced a similar environment while in Afghanistan just a few short years prior. That the Algerian Arabs can easily be swayed by foreign Takfiris, but Belhaj had already persuaded too many young men months prior to the conflict. They fled to the mountains. From there, they would fight the Algerian People's National Army, led by Mohammed Boudif, who was acting head of state. Boudif was completely dependent on the forces that had brought him to power, and his powers were circumscribed by the military and the security establishment. Boudif's ascension was halted as he was assassinated by Algerian Special Ops Groups, the GIS, under Lieutenant Lambarak Boudmarhafi, who is said to have acted as a lone government due to his Islamist sympathies. The country was now in full swing into a long, bloody civil war. What good could Anas do? A temporary exile in London and married. He thought back to his late spiritual advisor and close friend, Abdullah Anas. How would he have handled the precarious situation between the nationalist Algerian government and its military and the Salafi Takfiris in the mountains? He thought of a quote that Anas had made. Quote, and Ibn al-Qayyim confirmed a principle, saying that the human being, if his righteous deeds and benefit in the society are a lot, then he is foreign for things that often might not be forgiven for, and mistakes of his may be overlooked that would not be overlooked for others, because the messenger of Allah said, if water reaches 2 colors, measuring units, then it will not become impure by impurity. So a large volume of water, if some small impurity falls into it, does not have its impurity affected, and it could still be used for ablution and bathing. Likewise, the human being, if his good deeds are many, then one turns a blind eye to some of his bad deeds that are drowning in the ocean of good deeds. End quote. But what good deeds are happening in Algiers, thought Anas. With Boudif assassinated like his killer and his killer, Boudmarif sentenced to execution for his crimes, which was ultimately not carried out, the jails were too full of FIS members. On March 4th, 1992, the group was dissolved. However, the few members of the FIS that were free saw this as an act of war. With a long-standing conflict with an even more insular group, the Algerian government went to an even further freefall of the economy. Anas saw the problem in Algeria, as he also saw in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as he saw in Peshawar. Moderate Islam had been silenced by the words from the Takfiris. Salafis such as Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, Abu Qatada, and Abu Musab al-Suri took to the airwaves, radio broadcasts, tape cassettes, even leaflets. Any type of propaganda was invaded by these strange, dangerous men who used Islam as the springboard for their own degenerative, immoral ideals. They were even used the martyr of Abdullah Anas and sullied his name by asserting he was the influence of their ways when he was not. Al-Zawahiri had once lambasted Anas behind his back and insulted the sheikh while not even praying where the sheikh prayed at the mosque. Their propagation and preposterous statements gave their ideas validity, giving rise to the groups like the armed Islamic group in Algiers, which was the equivalent to the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. They were essentially a group who believed that the killing of civilians, journalists, and other people were permissible because they were people who subscribed to an infidel system, and by virtue of that, they were considered apostates. In a 2008 media interview with As-Sahab, the Al-Qaeda media arm, Ayman al-Zawahiri stated this, quote, "But I add that those who were killed on the 11th of December in Algeria are not from the innocents. Rather, according to the command meek from the brothers in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they are from the Crusader unbelievers and the government troops who defend them. Our brothers in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb are more truthful, more just, and more righteous than the lying sons of France who had sold Algeria to it and America, and who woo Israel in order for the head of the Crusader, America, to be pleased with them. These criminals who have attacked the Sharia and excluded it from government by force and rigging, and who have killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Muslims, and who helped the Americans and their Crusader allies to kill millions of Muslims cannot possibly be truthful nor just," end quote. It is believed that the Algerian security services, the Department of Intelligence and Security, DRS, had infiltrated the FIS and conducted numerous atrocities against the political faction of the FIS, as well as their supporters. This would be similar to the various conspiracy theories over the years that even the Foreign Intelligence Agency of the CIA, the British MI6, has also done the same with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in the Levant, although this is unfounded. With post-Azam Peshawar, a vacuum now exists with the long darkened valley. Immoral ideas and extremism now exist even to this day in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Afghanistan from Takfiri groups. The Al-Wila wal-Bana in Arabic crudely required Muslims to refrain befriending or loving non-Muslims. This slogan now resides in Peshawar, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. The Arabs now follow the works of the 13th century medieval scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, whom believed would solve all of Afghanistan's problems. However, they have only made them just begin. Anas, however, was attached to his native homeland now, Algeria, and his support with the FIS was unwavering, but also caused him to look over his shoulder because members of the GIA, who had a base in London, where he is a political exile. The GIA was a terrorist organization infiltrated by intelligence services, according to many who believe it. Anas could not believe what was happening in his country in which he loved. He would later lament, "You got the French out of the country. You achieved martyrdom. You performed acts of self-sacrifice, but you failed to build a state that would secure our freedoms." War had made Anas silent. All the killings and all the violence. What have I, Abdullah Anas, become from where I was before? With the ethnic conflict happening in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the jihad from Afghanistan continued to the Balkans and Algeria. Anas, however, could not continue to deny it. And he could not go along with it, not with a family who depended upon him. And so he became a stone figure, unmoved and silent. By May of 1996, bin Laden returned to Afghanistan with the Takfiris, Ayman al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda. He landed in Jalalabad under the auspices of the Rabbani government. He reached out to the Taliban and the Haqqani network in the Patkia province. The relationship was mutually beneficial. The Taliban used bin Laden's men against Massoud in the north, and the camps began to spring up in Jalalabad and Kandahar. Bin Laden was now fully in camp with the Salafis. No longer was he the shy insular Saudi. However, on September 9, 2001, Anas was chairing a meeting with FIS members when the news broke. Massoud was killed by European Arabs. Two men from Brussels, from the Tunisian fighting group, posing as journalists, with a letter from Egyptian activist Yassir Siri, to which Siri was duped by the men and did not do any background check regarding the credibility of the two. They had concealed a bomb inside the camera, which exploded when they set up the interview in close proximity to Massoud. Bin Laden was said to have ordered the killing. 2 days later, September 11, 2001, the terrorist attacks, to which blamed on Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, began. After the U.S. invasion into Afghanistan, the country, which was still reeling from the Soviet invasion and its aftermath, and its two civil wars brought on by the Taliban and the secular government, now has to endure the longest war in American history, which finally ended to the present day. The arrests and renditions had happened under the auspices of the CIA. Many people that Anas knew had been interrogated, tortured, and imprisoned. Yet, he was left alone. But why? He knew Azam. He knew bin Laden. He knew al-Suri. He knew Abu Hafs al-Masri. He knew Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was one of the primary founders of the MAC office. However, the answer had come to him after the smoke of wondering. It was his early proclamations against al-Qaeda which vindicated him. It was activism against the Takfiris, an activism that gave him an energy which vindicated Abdullah Anas. It was his true interpretation of Islam which saved him. In Jihad, the enemy had to be clear. The U.S. invasion into Afghanistan, the enemy was not clear. Afghans were not al-Qaeda, yet they were deemed so. So why were these Takfiris on the airwaves, such as Al Jazeera, talking about Jihad and Azam as they knew him? They were hardly on the battlefield. They used Azam's name when they insulted him daily when he was alive. Anas could no longer be silent, for he knew he could use his weight of being a former Jadid and try and save Afghanistan. The country which needed him the most in 1980 needed him again 31 years later. Thus, he returned back into the mountains, not to be silent, but to speak about a resolution to conflict. He met with former old members of the Taliban faction from Mullah Omar, who agreed the conflict had to end. Or the foreign military of the West will either continue the conflict on for years or end up eventually like the Soviets, in which they did in the summer of 2021. If the way is closed, it is closed. I am not an ambassador. God knows I tried my best. Abdullah Anas, regarding Afghanistan mediations with the Taliban, had walked away proud and vindicated.